In order to understand the inner nature of poetry as an art, it is essential to remember that it is a primal and ancient art that predated the invention of writing. Ancient or tribal poetry was an oral and performative art, a special way of shaping speech to capture the listener's attention and stick in the memory. The audience actually saw and heard the poet or bard or shaman who was physically present. So, if poetry was originally direct speech from a person to an audience who could see and hear that performer, then the notion of voice and speaker is clearly fundamental to the art. We instinctively listen to someone who is speaking in our presence. We try to identify, understand, and evaluate that speaker. When the art of poetry moved from the poet's mouth to the printed page, things got much more complicated. The reader could not see the person who was speaking. There might be an author's name on the page, but it wasn't always clear if the author was speaking in his or her own voice. Sometimes an author seemed to be imitating or impersonating another character. Sometimes the author said things that were hard to take seriously or in a literal sense. Was the author joking or being ironic? Did the author intend comedy or satire? A key to understanding any poem is to recognize the voice speaking. First, to determine who is speaking. Is it the author's own voice? Is it an imaginary character? Is it a historic or mythic character? Could it even be an animal or an inanimate object? When Louise Bogan titles a poem written in the first person, Cassandra, the experienced reader will suspect that the speaker is not Bogan herself, but the mythic Trojan priestess named in the title. Cassandra had the gift of prophecy, but was cursed that no one would believe her predictions. If we understand that Bogan is writing in that imaginary voice, the poem is easy to understand. Secondly, we need to determine to whom the voice is speaking. Sometimes the poem is addressed to a general listener. Sometimes it is addressed to a specific or even imaginary listener. The implied audience influences the meaning of the poem. When Langston Hughes writes a poem called Mother to Son, that determines the meaning because we know both who is speaking and who is her intended audience. 3, we need to determine what is the tone of the speaker. The tone is the speaker's attitude toward his or her own subject. Is it sincere, playful, sarcastic, ironic, sad, solemn, comic, or something else entirely? Tone is one of the most important aspects of poetry or any sort of writing or even any human communication. If we can determine the tone a speaker is taking, it helps us understand the intended meaning. As speakers and writers, it is important to remember how essential tone is. If you establish the right tone, your audience will understand you. If you don't, almost everything you say will be misunderstood. The same words can mean different things depending on the tone. Here's an example. If I say thank you, it can mean several different things. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Each of those utterances implies a relationship of the speaker to what is being said. Tone is a speaker's attitude toward his or her subject, and it is the way the speaker wants the audience to interpret things. I'm so glad you called. I'm so glad you called. The same words mean different things depending on the tone. Tone is the manner of expression in a work. It establishes the audience's expectation on how to interpret the work. Is tone something artificial or literary? No, we use it in everyday conversation. All human speech depends upon tone. Now, the most important kind of literary tone to consider, the most famous type of literary tone, is called irony. Irony is something that's often misunderstood, but it basically means that there is a difference between what is literally being said and what is being meant. Sometimes irony can say one thing and mean the opposite. Sometimes it's just a gap between the two of them. Here are 4 things that you might hear in everyday conversation that are often meant ironically. Somebody comes into a room and someone leans over to whisper to you, "Here comes Mr. Big Spender." What is probably being meant is that this person is not a big spender, that this person is tight-fisted. Or if someone comes in and they say, "Here comes Mr. Humility," you can be almost 100% sure that this person is not in the least humble. Irony is a way of intensifying meaning by saying sometimes something that is the opposite of what is being meant. Extreme, bitter irony is called sarcasm. Sarcasm is an irony that is meant to hurt or mock the target. It is important to realize that not all poems are autobiographical. There is often an imaginary character speaking or an exaggerated version of the writer. Now, sometimes poems are overtly autobiographical, but it is naive to assume that a poem automatically expresses a direct and sincere statement by the author of something that really happened. Poetry is usually a bit more complicated. To illustrate the simple fact that not all poems are spoken as autobiographical statements by the writer, let me offer a couple of short comic poems. About 20 years ago, there was a fad on the internet called dog poetry and cat poetry, mostly in the form of dog haiku and cat haiku. These purported to be haiku actually written by cats and dogs. It took the typical haiku structure of 2 images in a certain number of syllables and presented the world as seen by a cat or a dog. I think it's a pretty good guess that these were not in fact written by cats or dogs, although they were published anonymously. Here are 2 cat haiku. You're always typing. Well, let's see you ignore my sitting on your hands. It's a rather good haiku. You have the image of the author typing, and then you have the image of the cat sitting on his or her hands. Or here's another cat haiku. Humans are so strange. Mine lies still in the bed, then screams. My claws aren't that sharp. Dog haiku and cat haiku are important because they show you that in a poem, what you're reading is not necessarily the direct utterance of a human being in an actual situation, describing things realistically in their own words, but it is a constructed verbal artifact. It is shaped language, and the language takes shapes that often go beyond the facts of the situation. But let's look at an autobiographical poem now and see how the tone works. This is a poem by the American poet Robert Hayden, and it looks back to his childhood. It is called Those Winter Sundays. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? This is a poem of Robert Hayden speaking very accurately about his own childhood. He had a very difficult father who was easily angered and was quite abusive to his children. But as he goes back into the poem, the tone is really quite powerful. He's acknowledging that there was anger in the house. He was acknowledging of his indifference to his father. But what has happened is that the poem is now retrospective. Something has happened in Robert Hayden's life which allows him to see his own father differently. When you look at when the poem was written, you speculate that it's probably that now that Hayden himself is a father, he has begun to see his own experience not only from a son's point of view, but from a father's. So the poem has, I think, a tone that is sincere, it is slightly sad, it is retrospective, and it is sympathetic. And that emotion permeates the poem. We have a sense of a sensitive, intelligent man looking up back to his own difficult childhood with understanding and empathy. The tone of that work helps us interpret the meaning. Where do we really understand the tone most clearly? It's probably in the last two lines. He actually repeats a phrase twice. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? What he is doing is, in a sense, admitting his own inability to understand this until he, by implication, has himself fulfilled love's austere and lonely offices. Now, let me give you a very different poem about a child written just a little bit earlier. This is a poem by Weldon Kees. It was published in 1941. The date, I think, will prove to be significant. You know who it's addressed to. It's called For My Daughter. So it is a father addressing his own daughter. And the poem goes like this. For my daughter. Looking into my daughter's eyes, I read beneath the innocence of morning flesh, concealed hintings of death she does not heed. Coldest of winds have blown this hair, and mesh of seaweed snarled these miniatures of hands. The night's slow poison, tolerant and bland, has moved her blood. Parched years that I have seen, that may be hers appear. Foul, lingering death in certain war, the slim legs green. Or, fed on hate, she relishes the sting of others' agony, perhaps the cruel bride of a syphilitic or a fool. These speculations sour in the sun. I have no daughter. I desire none. Now, that is a poem which, as you realize, addresses an imaginary character. We begin it thinking that it's written to an actual girl, the daughter of the poet. This is written in 1941, right before America enters World War II, which is already a conflict that has killed millions of people in Europe, Asia, and Africa. The tone of this poem is bitter. It is a kind of deep, deep agony about the realities of life. But by giving it the title For My Daughter, by allowing us to believe that somehow it expresses a father's regard for his own child, we, in a sense, become more vulnerable to the bitterness, of its vision. So it is an imaginary listener, though not an imaginary speaker. Unfortunately, Kees is speaking in his own voice. He and his wife decided not to have children. Sometimes a poet adopts what we call a persona. Persona is the Latin word for a mask. And you know this from pictures of ancient drama in which the actors would put on masks. They could be tragic masks, they could be comic masks, but they, in a sense, showed that they were representing a mythic or imaginary character. So a persona in poetry is a fictitious voice or character created by an author to be the speaker of a literary work. Let me now go to a poem in which the author uses a persona. This is a famous American poem, Luke Havergal, written by Edwin Arlington Robinson. And Robinson creates an imaginary speaker in a fictional situation who is speaking out of the agony of a dramatic moment. Luke Havergal. Go to the western gate, Luke Havergal, there where the vines cling crimson on the wall, and in the twilight wait for what will come. The leaves will whisper there of her, and some, like flying words, will strike you as they fall. But go, and if you listen, she will call. Go to the western gate, Luke Havergal, Luke Havergal. No, there is not a dawn in eastern skies to rift the fiery night that's in your eyes. But there where western glooms are gathering, the dark will end the dark, if anything. God slays himself with every leaf that flies, and hell is more than half of paradise. No, there is not a dawn in eastern skies, in eastern skies. Out of the grave I come to tell you this. Out of a grave I come to quench the kiss that flames upon your forehead with a glow, that blinds you to the way that you must go. Yes, there is yet one way to where she is, bitter, but one that faith may never miss. Out of a grave I come to tell you this, to tell you this. There is the western gate, Luke Havergal. There are the crimson leaves upon the wall. Go, for the winds are tearing them away. Nor think to riddle the dead words they say, nor any more to feel them as they fall. But go, and if you trust her, she will call. There is the western gate, Luke Havergal, Luke Havergal. Now this is a beautiful, mysterious poem. It was, in a funny way, the poem that years later made Edwin Arlington Robinson famous when the then sitting president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, actually reviewed the book. Roosevelt remarked he wasn't entirely sure what Luke Havergal meant, but he was entirely sure that he liked it. And I think that's probably been the response of many people who love this poem. But the key to understanding Luke Havergal is to figure out the voice. And so you should ask 3 questions. Who is speaking? What does the person want from Luke Havergal? And should Luke Havergal do it? So, who is speaking? What does the speaker want? And should Luke Havergal, who is being addressed, agree to do this? And that is a kind of fascinating series of questions to ask for this test, because we don't know much about this speaker, except that the speaker, in describing himself, says, "Out of a grave, I come to tell you this. Out of a grave, I come to quench the kiss." So the speaker basically claims that he comes from the dead and seems to know what's going on in Luke Havergal's mind and Luke Havergal's heart, and how certain things in the future will work out, or at least he claims to know this. He says, go to the western gate. So what he's asking Luke Havergal to do is really simple. Go to the western gate, Luke Havergal, there where the vines cling crimson on the wall. So what is the western gate? Now that's interesting. Now, if you look at this, a gate is where you go from one place to another. And what is the west? The west is where the sun sets. And so the western expansive reality of the world is often associated with either the future or with death. So it seems as if the speaker is saying, go to the western gate, Luke Havergal, and in the twilight, wait for what will come. And what seems to be coming is a whisper from someone else. Now, you can look at this poem grammatically. It's really quite interesting. There's an I, who is the speaker. There is a you, who is Luke Havergal. But there's also a she, a her, who is someone that Luke Havergal wants to hear from, wants to be with. And so I think that we almost instinctively, intuitively recognize that Luke Havergal has been in love with a woman whom he has lost to death. And what the speaker is offering him is a way of reuniting himself with this lost woman. And so that says, well, who's speaking? Somebody from the underworld, as it were. So it's either a dead soul, or perhaps, if you take a certain mythological point of view, considering that what he's advising Luke Havergal to do, it is a demon. Or you could be psychoanalytic and say this is a voice inside of Luke Havergal's head that is addressing him to take this action. And the action does seem to be to join the beloved through death, presumably, since Luke Havergal does not seem to be an old man, through suicide. The question is, can we trust the speaker to say, look, if you do kill yourself, you'll be with this woman that you love? Well, it does seem that the speaker is, being somewhat misleading. For example, he goes, there where western glooms are gathering. So there on the western horizon where the sun is setting, the dark will end the dark, if anything. God slays himself with every leaf that flies, and hell is more than half of paradise. Now, those are two debatable assertions. Does God slay himself every time a leaf falls? Presumably not, because God, the notion of God is the eternal, the powerful. It's not something that depends upon the seasons. And hell is not necessarily more than half of paradise. It seems that hell is much less than that. So we have a sense of an untrustworthy speaker. And so who's speaking? What is being asked for the listener to do? And should Luke Havergal do this? Well, whether Luke Havergal decides to end his life or not is up to him. But if he is doing it to go into a mildly positive hell in which he will have a happy reunion with his dead lover, it's probably not a good idea. But this just shows you, in a sense, how poets operate. They create a voice, they imply, or in this case, state a listener, and they can create an imaginary drama of great power and evocative emotions. Let me read a poem in which irony is so important that you can't possibly understand the text without recognizing the irony. It is by a German poet named Erich who died in 1988, and it's called The Measures Taken. The lazy are slaughtered. The world grows industrious. The ugly are slaughtered. The world grows beautiful. The foolish are slaughtered. The world grows wise. The sick are slaughtered. The world grows healthy. The sad are slaughtered. The world grows merry. The old are slaughtered. The world grows young. The enemies are slaughtered. The world grows friendly. The wicked are slaughtered. The world grows good. Now, this is a very short poem. It's only 16 lines in a kind of couplet. It seems to be a kind of narrative. It just says, these are the steps that were taken to make the world good. The voice is authoritative, and the tone is factual. It's indeed clinical. And what it basically purports is that by killing 8 different classes of people, we've made a better, happier, and healthier society. Now, I think almost anyone who hears this poem realizes that it is entirely backward, that this is a poem in which literally every word is ironic. To understand the basis of the irony, I think it's important to think about the author's life. Erich was born in 1921 in Vienna in a German-speaking Jewish family. Austria was annexed as part of the German Empire of Adolf Hitler, and Fried and his family fled to London, but not before his father was murdered by the Gestapo. He is, in a sense, describing the deep fallacy, the deep delusion of the National Socialists. The form of the poem is really quite interesting. It's these 16 lines in couplets, and there are 2 beats for every line. The lazy are slaughtered. The world grows industrious. The ugly are slaughtered, the world grows beautiful. The foolish are slaughtered, the world grows wise. The syntax of every, two lines is identical. In fact, the verb in the second line of every stanza is grows, 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 grows. There are only 4 words in each line. It is a poem which has a kind of no-nonsense structure to mirror its factual, clinical statements. Erich Fried's Measures Taken is a masterpiece of tone. By creating this clinical language in which every statement is deeply ironic, he allows us to see into the depths of the delusions of the Third Reich. And he creates a poem so simple that any reader can understand it. The irony makes the nightmare bearable for us to read and understand. That is the power of irony.